Well, hello, everybody. This is Jonathan Weedman with Community Conversations presented by the Outlook Newspaper Group. And I am so excited this morning to have with me a very special guest, a real leader in the nonprofit sector, not just here locally, but nationally and beyond. And a friend of mine for over 45 years, Henry Ramos, somebody who I can't say that about many people. So, Henry, thank you so much for joining us today. So looking forward to our conversation. How are things in Palm Springs this morning?
Well, Jonathan, first and foremost, thank you so much for your lovely introduction and for having me. I'm really honored and excited to have a conversation with you. And yeah, I'm a new resident here in Palm Springs, and I have to say I'm the most surprised. I didn't know that I would find my groove here, but as you well know, as a former resident yourself, there's a lot to be had here in Palm Springs. So no complaints on my part starting out
Oh,
2022 in the desert.
you're gonna absolutely love it. And I miss it. I miss it. I'll be back. We'll be back one day.
You'll be out here
We'll be
as our
back like
guest.
the Hamilton tune goes. So, well, let me have I've known you for so many years. And it's interesting how our professional uh our careers sort of intersected as they
Isn't it
did.
amazing?
Yeah, I think it's the best. But let's start at the beginning. Tell me, where did you grow up? And tell me what that was like. Where did you go to school? And what led you on this path? Because, when we were kids, you grow up to be a doctor, a lawyer, or some professional, and we didn't even know what social justice and activism was. So, what led you on this path? Because I think it's a pretty amazing story.
Well, thank you for asking and for taking me back to the incipiency. Like you, I grew up in the Los Angeles area, West Los Angeles, Santa Monica. I grew up in a relatively comfortable upper middle class Latino family, which at that time was quite unusual. Sadly, remains somewhat still unusual today,
Yeah.
although we've made tremendous progress since our youth. But I grew up and went to public schools, but the better public schools. You know all about that because we graduated high school together at University High School.
Same year. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I spent a lot of my youth doing the things that we did back in the day in that cultural milieu. I mean, was at the beach a lot. You know, out at Santa Monica Beach, Station 25 or 26 on any
Right.
given summer afternoon. I played a lot of sports. I was very artistically oriented, so I got involved early in the whole mural making movement that Judy Baca and others really helped to lift up back in that day. And I think about the time that you and I were high school students, I began to get a lot more clarity about the social, racial, economic disparities that really were pronounced in the 1960s and 1970s, and that produced so much social unrest and political conflict. And we grew up in a time where, although it's really bad today, and we'll talk more about that, people forget that in 1968 alone, Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated within a 4-month period. There were
Right.
massive riots at the Chicago Democratic National Convention and in the streets all across the country. There was tremendous unrest. And I think that politicized me early in my game and made me realize, particularly as a Latino who had privilege, that I had certain responsibilities. And it wasn't just about going off and sort of taking care of myself by being a doctor or a
Right.
lawyer or some kind of like easily classified professional destination, but rather that, I had certain social responsibilities that required me to think a bit bigger about my voice and my role. And that's how I think I pursued the path that took me to philanthropy.
It is extraordinary and uncommon, quite frankly. And we're just almost exact same age, and I remember those times very well. I have a vivid recollection of the night that Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. We lived
At the Ambassador Hotel.
near,
Yeah.
yeah, we lived near the Ambassador Hotel, and
Mhm.
remember hearing the sirens in the night racing up Olympic Boulevard, and of course seeing it
It
on
was
the
a dark
news.
time. It
It's a
was a
very
dark
dark time,
time.
and I think it informed a lot of people of our generation um, uh, about things that really mattered. You know, as someone who's worked in our sector for so many years and accomplished so much, I mean, they may seem self-evident, but what are the urgent questions and priorities and issues facing our nation right now? I mean, I personally feel myself in our community, in our world, we are at a crossroads. I think that we really are. You hear that and it sounds a little overused and hackneyed, but I do believe we are at an inflection point. Are you optimistic? What are your concerns? Tell me.
That's a great set of questions, and I really appreciate you giving me the stage to reflect with you on them. I think overall I remain optimistic for the long term, and maybe precisely because you and I did kind of grow up in our incipient years in a time that was at least as bad as now, and there were healing, not perfect, but healing years thereafter that took us to much better heights, right? So I'm always optimistic that certainly if it can happen anywhere in the United States of America, there is room for recovery and healing. But in the shorter term, I'm very concerned because, in effect, I do feel like even more so than was the case in the 1960s, I feel that the nation has divided in such a fashion that we are effectively in what I would call an emerging new civil war. Or you might argue the other way that the Civil War that was fought in the 1860s never was finally fully resolved, and we're paying the price for that because many of the issues that we're grappling with really go back to the heart of what it is that we want to stand for as a nation. And my personal feeling is that much of it is driven by the new demographics and the sense of a very uncomfortable and uncertain, sometimes maybe more than ever struggling white working class, facing demographic changes that reveal to them that they are losing place and power, at least in their definition of those terms. And rather than embracing the inevitability of the changes that we are facing and making them work for all of us, I think there's this very strong resistance that we're seeing. And it's not always presented in racial terms, but I think the informing aspects of it are driven by racial conflict. And so the social landscape is very complicated by that reality. And then you have this, at the same time, this really disturbing economy that I would argue has been stagnant now for probably since we were young people coming up. It's had ups and downs, booms and busts, but we've gotten to the point now in American political economy where every decade there's a massive undoing of some kind. Some of it human-made, some of it like COVID, something that just happens. But our economy is really unsettled. And this is the kind of thing that happened in Germany during the 1930s, where you have this confluence of intergroup tension with severe economic anxiety. And then the political system is taken hostage by people that have these very extreme views. And I think that's what we're living through right now as a nation, really for the first time in our history since, at least the Civil War. And I think the book is still being written on what the outcome of this is going to be. I'm hopeful, but it's not going to be an easy passage to a solution.
I am too. I have to be, but you're absolutely right. When you think particularly around the economy, the lack of affordable housing in many of our major cities, the paucity of housing period, the homeless crisis that has impacted Los Angeles to a degree which I've never seen before. Right. And then of course, people's earnings, income, the wealth gap, the amount of debt that people are carrying, the cost of education. I have friends who have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of school loans. And it goes on and on and on. And I think, I have to be optimistic. I believe you're right. Things will work out, but we're going to have some rough seas ahead, I think. And it's uncomfortable to say the least. You've written a book a couple of years ago, A Democracy in the Next American Economy, where poverty meets justice.
No, where prosperity.
I'm sorry. Don't get old. Oh, that's right. It's too late. We are old. Let me read it here again. It's the glasses. Where prosperity meets justice. And I know you're working as a senior fellow at the new Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. So let me ask you this as a leader in the sector for so many years. And it's sort of funny, Henry, that even now from your many years of experience, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm just getting started.
No.
What would you say are the new imperatives for California philanthropy and the nonprofit sector in today's, fast changing and somewhat unprecedented environment? Because philanthropy is changing. So how would you talk about that?
Well, I'm obviously like you. I'm a product of the philanthropic profession, and I'm a big fan of much of what I see happening, and of many of the leaders that I see, really exercising vision. And in Los Angeles, where you and I came up and where we know a lot of that landscape most intimately, I think LA does pretty well. I mean, one of the issues that we are concerned about is representation and diversity in philanthropy. And certainly in Los Angeles, the leadership that I see in place today versus the leadership that would have been in those same institutions 45 years ago when you and I met are radically different. So, you have a place like the California Endowment where Dr. Bob Ross is the CEO, and the California Wellness Foundation, Judy Belk, both of them strong African-American leaders, not just here in the region, but nationally and internationally. You've spoken to Miguel Santana at the Weingart Foundation, who's a very impressive new leader in that space. Antonio Hernandez at the California Community Foundation has been at the helm there for quite a while. And all of these leaders are, I think, through their voice and their actions, making significant change in the field possible. So it goes to show that representation and diversity matters. On the other hand, I think what we know, particularly through much of the study that I'm doing now at the New School at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, is rooted in more structural analysis about, how our institutions are often very impersonally driven to biases that even with people of color and women or LGBTQ people or other diverse people running them, are not easily changed, are not easily swayed to do the right thing because they're just embedded in a history of logic and rules and regulations that really were driven by inequality and the intent to keep it that way. So I think we're in a period of time right now where we're trying to translate many of the visible gains that we've seen in staffing, appointments, even grant making, and impact on policies that affect communities in need. But our structures oftentimes hold us back from really amplifying the gains that come from that. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in talking about with you and others is the need for philanthropy to be much more aggressive and much more collectively driven to change right now. Historically, the field has been, for understandable reasons, very reticent to be involved in political dialogue or discourse that could get people in trouble for taking sides, that could politicize the field, and those are very legitimate concerns. But I think we're in a moment right now, and you put your finger on it, that is not normal. This is a make or break situation where our very democracy and our way of life is really up for grabs. And it's not going to just end nicely because it's always ended nicely for America. We have to do the work. We have to do the thinking, and we have to make the changes. So I'm looking for philanthropy going forward to think about new and different ways to face those challenges. For example, we are known principally for making grants to community agencies and nonprofits that do remarkable work addressing needs in our communities. And we've throw a lot of money at those problems, and we have made a difference. But when you look at the way philanthropy works, really, by law, only 5% of the asset holdings of foundations are required to be spent on grants at a time when, frankly, much more of that kind of money is needed. We can up the 5% rule to something a little bit more generous to give us more leeway. We have organizations like the California Endowment that are innovating around things like using social bonds to expand their capacity to make grants. But frankly, Jonathan, at the core of it, my strong impulse is to go beyond even these important ideas and innovations to look at the 95% of our asset holdings that are sitting in institutional investment accounts. And frankly, oftentimes investing in businesses or enterprises that are creating many of the problems that we're trying to solve on the grant making side. So when you look at the environment and pollution and the kind of unmet costs that society has to make up for, a lot of the businesses that we're supporting through our investments are producing that pollution or that spillover. Right. And when you look at the human fallout of how employees are treated or people are affected by business machinations, I would say that it's time for the nonprofit sector and for philanthropy generally to rethink its investment portfolio and to really look at social purpose and environmentally responsible investments as the new standard for the way to invest and make money.
It's a very nuanced but very powerful issue. I was reading this morning in the New Yorker, a fascinating article about the impact of the permafrost in the Soviet Union and various parts of Russia, and how that's impacting the climate, and how investment in industries that are in those areas are degrading the quality of the land, of the ground, and severely impacting carbon emissions in our thing. I mean, it all intersects. And I also would just say that the George Floyd incident, tragedy, the murder of this man, I think was an inflection point in our country, and where it has brought about a reckoning that is touching so many aspects of our world and our nation. I think that that event really, everybody had enough at that point. I think it really was a turning point, and I'm seeing more diversity. I'm seeing more leadership changes. I'm seeing more, serious, strong acknowledgement about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our sector. There was a story in the LA Times several months ago about arts boards in Los Angeles, and then among 20 of them, there were 550 seats and only 15 held by African Americans. That's just unacceptable. That's just unacceptable. And Latinos, not much more. So all of this is happening, at this time. And you touched a bit upon this, but I'd love you to talk a little bit more because we have some topics here that I wanted to discuss with you. But why is it important or essential for our leading social sector institutions to play a more active and concerted role than ever at addressing these issues? We used to just give money to the United Way and the Boys or Girls Club would go home.
Right. Yeah.
Why is it important? That's what we did.
Well, I think that it's more important than ever because of the context that we've been talking about here, and the fact that we have what I think is effectively a stagnant economy that is badly in need of transformation. We are, I think, in the equivalent phase of our evolution in our day as people were maybe 100 and 120 years ago, when we were moving very decidedly from an agricultural economy to an industrial and urban economy. And now we're moving into a post-industrial information economy. And it's a hard thing to make work. So no one is suggesting that this is easy to do, but the hard reality is that we must do it. And the reason why it's important for the nonprofit sector and foundations and philanthropy to weigh in ways that we haven't before is because our politics are stagnant. Our politics are so toxic. They are so geared to not getting anything done in a time where things badly need to be done. And the economy is stagnant in the ways that we've talked about because we are at the end of the fuse when it comes to the kind of model that we've been building wealth around. And the sad reality is that even though promises have been made and social contracts have been made around the idea that, we're going to support our business community to create wealth that will then be distributed and shared in terms of how we manage our prosperity, we know that many, many, many trillions of dollars in wealth have been created over the last 40 years. But when we look at the standard of living for workers and more moderate income people, we don't see them benefiting the way that we see the super wealthy benefiting. And that's why in Los Angeles, you have 60,000 people out on the street without a roof over their heads every night. That's why we have social unrest in our streets. And that's why our political system is under such duress to create more responsiveness, because that movie is something that most of us are getting tired of watching. Philanthropy has to take a position. That's just the bottom line in the nature of the times in which we live. There's more that we can do, and there's more that we should do.
So let me ask you a question. This is kind of a ringer in a sense, and I mean, we're not homeless experts, but the homeless crisis has just continued and grown. And I was downtown the other day, and it's the worst I've ever seen, and not just in downtown, but throughout Los Angeles.
I agree.
Overpasses, unreal.
Very
and
sad.
we have mayor's election coming up in a year, and we got a bunch of folks throwing their hat in the ring. County Board of Supervisors. There's, I think, one open seat, I know for sure, council. And nothing's changed. Nothing's getting done. And people are really getting angry about it.
Mhm.
People are getting tired of the way it's impacting their lives, people whose businesses, whose homes, the crime. There have been assaults, a couple of murders. What do you think is the solution? Or can you just, is it building more supportive housing? Is it moving everybody out to Lancaster and Palmdale and saying, figure it out until you can come back to town? Is it just sweeping them from one block to the next? What is the investment?
Well,
What's it going to take?
yeah, that's a very hard and intractable problem to solve with just one particular thing. It's going to take a lot
Yeah.
of things, and maybe some of them are in combination with the things you've just talked about. But I think, again, when you think about what's it going to take, I feel like we need some modeling. I feel like we need some demonstration efforts that really help policy leaders and business and economic leaders understand that, well, the kinds of efforts you're talking about are important short-term fixes. They're not going to help us in the long term address the root of the problem. And I feel like, we have, first of all, a society that is a throwaway society that is producing people who are so unable to maintain that this is the only option that they're left, to go out on the streets and to live, and hope for the best, without any of the basic supports that, we would call compatible with what it means to be an American, right?
Mhm.
I think that social services need to be more integrated. I think there needs to be a lot more alignment and integration of efforts, not just across the nonprofit sector, but with government agencies, so that there is, better and higher uses of our investment dollars, so that the outcomes and results are more impactful. But I also think that, again, in the spirit of the times and my call to action for extraordinary measures, I think that this is a place where philanthropy could do a lot to demonstrate what's possible for government and economic leaders to pick up and scale. I would love to see philanthropy come together around major joint investments, for example, in whole corridors of property acquisition in lower and moderate income communities, and negotiate with the people in those homes in ways that enable them to start acquiring equity. In other words, rather than having to have $100,000 down payment, let's get people that are already in place. Let's buy those properties and create like land trusts or social investment instruments that don't have to respond quite as much to the market as commercial actors have to. And let's let them prove over time, as they continue to make their rents and they achieve 5 years of making their rents on time, let's give them 20% interest in the equity of that property in the next 5 years as they continue. Let's let them acquire full ownership of those properties so that they can build their assets and frankly, their economic and their political power to stand on their own two legs, and to not be forced through gentrification to go out to Lancaster, like you said, and have to see what happens, right? There's ways that I think philanthropy can actively join forces on the level of tactics as well as joint capital investments to make things like that happen, that are outside the box of anything that we've really ever done, but that are really, really responsive to the moment of history that we're in. And if there's, anyone that can do it without the unfettered, presses that come with being in politics or being in the business community, where, every 4 years or every 2 years, you got to get it reelected, or every quarter, you got to show a profit, gain. If anyone could do it, it seems like the social investment, philanthropic community ought to be able to drive that kind of innovation.
I love it. My aunt used to say, habit is stronger than hate. You get used to something, and you just get used to something.
Yeah.
She also used to say, if it ain't broke, break it. I used to love that saying.
Well, then we may need to
If
make
it
that the
ain't
bumper
broke,
sticker of the day.
right. If it ain't broke, break it. So let me, I love it. It's great stuff. So let me ask you, as a sage of the profession, we've seen so much change in philanthropy in the last 20 years in our town. I think some of it for the better, some of it has been unfortunate. I think the exodus of many major corporations, there's a lot to say about where it's going. And we've gone through a hell of a time with this COVID event, and certainly prior to that, the economy, the struggles that all nonprofits go through. And as someone who's done fundraising, as somebody who has worked in the sector, what advice or direction or guidance or encouragement would you provide to folks working in the nonprofit world right now, some of whom are struggling to keep their doors open, struggling to pay their staff? You know, top level, you know, granular, whatever. What would you offer them right now?
Well, first of all, I would give them a big air hug and a massive personal congratulations and note of gratitude for committing their time and their talent and their vision to God's work. This is really a time when I wish more people were bringing their talent to our sector, because really we've never been more needed than we are right now. I would also say that, you know, for better or for worse, because of the constraints of the times we live in, particularly the fiscal constraints, I think, you know, I'm the board chairman of the Nonprofit Finance Fund in New York, and we think and talk a lot about these questions. But I think more than ever, there is need for those nonprofits that are struggling to find common cause by coming together in more concerted, mutually supportive ways. So not all trying to do it in isolation. I think they need to find the help that organizations like the Nonprofit Finance Fund and comparable groups can provide in terms of technical assistance and facilitative capitalization and training, advisory services. I think that they need to take advantage of all of the best practice knowledge and information that's out there. And the hardest thing I have to say, though, is that we may be reaching a time as a sector where, for a number of reasons related to issues we've covered, Jonathan, we may need to rethink how we're organized. And there may be a need, frankly, as hard as it is to say, for some organizations to either consolidate and merge with other organizations to elevate their scale and their potency, or to consider closing if they are simply not able to meet the basic requirements that they themselves would establish as the benchmarks of success, and to redirect their resources, their energy, and their talent to other efforts that are more likely to be, you know, traction driven in the short term. That's a hard thing to say, that we need to think about triaging. But in reality, the times are such, the moment in history is such, the imperative is such that I think we need to kind of sometimes take more distance from our personal stake and our personal interests as organizational leaders and entities, and we need to think about what's best for the people and what's best for our field. And that may mean some sacrifices and some changes that are not natural or easy to make. Agree.
Wow, that's great stuff. But it painful but true. You know, we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the coming years. I always love to ask about leadership. I think leadership is really important. And I like to say I've had some great bosses. I've had some great leaders in my career. Some who've been transformational and inspiring, and some, Henry, who ought to be in jail now that I think about it. I won't name names, but we've all had great bosses and not so great bosses. How would you describe your leadership style? You've led organizations, you've led groups of people, you've led employees. What, in your estimation, makes a great leader? And then secondly, who are some of the people, the contemporary, historic, that have influenced your lives, who you look up to, who are inspiring? So what makes a great leader, and who are some of your heroes?
Wow, those are great questions. Well, on the what makes a great leader thing, and what I try to deploy on as a leader in my own work is that, you know, we grew up in that like late 20th century timeframe where the mark of leadership was kind of being very imperial and telling people do this and do that. And I have learned, and I'm grateful to have learned it, that those days are ebbing, if not over. I mean, you don't lead by, you know, slamming a hammer on someone's head these days. You lead by example. You lead by inspiring. You lead by bringing people with you, and by building coalitions, and by making really smart decisions about the teams that you surround yourself with. And rather than having to have all the answers and all the authority, I think, you know, you operate less with a clenched fist and more with open hands to seek counsel, to seek advice, to seek consensus where that is required to move from point A to point B and beyond. And that is something that is, for many Americans, not natural. It's not sort of the way that our culture has sort of inclined us. But I think this is the new way, particularly in a multicultural society that is renegotiating our social contract as we speak. I think it's terribly important to have that approach. And I think above all, it's important to be extremely inclusive. We live in times where, if you have a team of any consequence that does not reflect the new demographics of our reality, whether you like it or not, you are not doing your job. You're not being responsive. You're not being a leader.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that I would say. And in terms of who has inspired me over my journey, certainly there's noted figures like the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King Jr. And others of that ilk that have had a significant impact on me. John Lewis is somebody who came out of that same era, and we just lost him recently, who I always found to be a remarkably humble servant leader. And that it's people like that that I'm inclined to follow, who had strong points of view and who really had important roles in history, but who really fell on the side of our better angels, and who really understood that it is not in the American way or in the American interest to suppress and repress things that are frankly part of the human journey.
Yeah.
And I'll just close by saying this is one great thing about California and our role in the world, if you will, that gives me reason to be hopeful, because California, despite however clumsy, however plotting, however back and forth it is, California is demonstrating over and over again in each domain that's important what it means to be a functioning, healthy, multicultural society. California has problems. We have the homelessness problem. We have our own racial conflicts. We have political problems, but California is a monster. California is the fifth largest economy in the world. If you put Texas and Florida together, their economies would not be bigger than California's. That's how significant California is. And it's not just about the economy, it's about the way that we drive culture, values, the notion of women's rights to reproductive health, the notion that LGBTQ people should have the right to live their life to the fullest. That people of color should have the right to govern and the right to be represented in their body politic. I mean, California has been at the forefront of all of these issues. So this is what gives me hope that we can continue to be a beacon for the nation and the world by demonstrating, not the rancor of frustration about what we don't have, but the celebration and the advancement of what we do have. And I'm hopeful that if we can kind of come to that wisdom, the future can be a very bright and robust one for this nation and for our state.
Indeed, Henry. I love what you said. It would be, I think, such a beautiful note to conclude our conversation, but I'm not done yet.
You got more.
I've got more.
Wow.
So as we glide toward the stop, I the last few years have been such a time of personal self-appraisal, and certainly as you get older, you start to think about QTR, quality time remaining.
You should, right?
And things in life become, more acute, I think, than when we were in our 20s and 30s. So let me ask you, particularly for folks who have, I hate to use been this just so challenged over the last year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
How does Henry Ramos recharge his batteries? What do you do for fun? How do you stay sane? What are things in life that bring you joy? I know one thing that I can think of that you're really good at. But what are those things, Henry? Tell us, what advice would you impart in that regard?
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we all need to find our humanity in times like this in ways that, really require a degree of intentionality. I think we have to have places and spaces where we can laugh and where we can be joyous and where we can feel self-fulfilled. And, in today's, day and age, it's hard to get that in the public space because of all the issues that we've covered, which are so intense. But I do think that, we all have personal passions. And I think that, as one gets through the pipeline, you do yourself a great disservice if you aren't listening carefully and following those passions. So my passions are things like art. I'm an artist and I create original art. I love to watch classic movies. My wife, Claudia, and I are big classic movie buffs. We love cuisine. We love to travel. Obviously, those things are less easy to do now in our COVID moment, but those are things that are wonderful. And I think above all, most importantly, we love to connect with people that are very special and important to us, whether that's family or longtime friends or people that we admire. I think that in communications with people that are meaningful to us, we have found that we're not alone, that many of the fears and anxieties that we're facing are shared, that we're not operating kind of in a space that makes us feel like we're just nuts or crazy, that, actually what we're experiencing is something that we're all struggling with. And I hate to say that, misery loves company, but there is something reassuring about knowing that you're not just making it up. And there's something really healing about being able to be with people that you care about in that way, that helps them and helps you to find your way forward in the best possible way that you can. That's what love, that's what family, that's what friendship, that's what community, that is what philanthropy is ultimately all about.
Yeah.
It's about finding our way forward, holding hands together, and understanding our differences and respecting those differences where they exist, but finding, more importantly, the spaces that we hold in common as human beings and building from that. And when I can do that, I feel fulfilled and I feel alive.
I love it, Henry. Those are beautiful thoughts, wonderful words, and thank you so much. I think I'm just going to have to call you every morning for a pep talk now from here on in. It really is what you really beautifully synthesize what matters and what is important in life. No, really, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending time. This I hope will be, I know will be the first of more conversations with you like this. And I can't thank you enough for spending some time today, sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your feelings and your Henry Ramos. You're amazing.
The thanks are mine, Jonathan. I'd say that, not only was it a pleasure, but also I want to extend gratitude and recognition to you and your husband, Ray, for co-producing this important series. I think there's something for all of us to gain from these conversations that you're advancing. And I'm just really, really honored and thrilled to be one of the people that you decided to speak with. So thanks for making it a great experience.
Well, thank you, Henry. I'm grateful to you. You're what we call a heavy hitter. You're a headliner.
I'm going to keep up with you, man.
Well, every good wish. Best love to you and Claudia, and I will talk to you real soon. Thank you for
Jonathan.
Joining the community conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
Awesome.